Be'ezras Hashem Yisparech, we are continuing with Perek Revi'i in the Rambam's Hilchos Talmud Torah, the fourth chapter in the Rambam's Laws of Torah Study in his Sefer Mada, his book of knowledge. In today's Perek, we are going to discuss different aspects of Kavod HaTorah, the honor given to Torah, and how to ask questions and where to learn. Halacha Aleph, the Rambam begins, Ein melamdin divrei Torah el talmid hagin. You shouldn't teach Torah except to a student that is fitting, na b'maisav, who is literally attractive in his deeds, meaning he has good deeds. I litam, or to somebody who you don't know what his intentions are. Aval, but if your student is going down the wrong path, so if he's going down the wrong path, first you have to make sure that he returns to the right path. You correct his behavior, and then you can return him to the Beis HaMedrash to learn. Amru Chachamim, our sages taught us. Kol Hashena l'salmid she'eino hagid. Anybody who teaches Torah to somebody who's not fitting to be taught, ki'ilu zorak even lemarkulis. It's like somebody who throws a stone to Mercury. This was a type of worship of the false god Mercury, since the symbol of this deity was 3 stones in a triangle shape. The way that they used to serve him was throwing these stones, and that is what this teaching of somebody who is not fitting is compared to. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, Kitzrar even b'margema kain noisen l'chsil kavod. Somebody who gives a fool kavod, it's like shooting a rock from this slingshot, this type of false deity. Now, what's kavod? The ain kavod ala Torah, and there's no honor except Torah. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, kavod chachamim yinchalu, that the wise people should inherit this honor. We see from here that teaching these fools this type of Torah is compared to this service of the false deity. It is important to note that this rule only applies to the teacher. The student can continue to pursue Torah learning, and he can pursue to find himself a teacher. And if he is persistent enough, the teacher should teach him and be very wary of the fact that he's bordering on some of these paths. And he should instruct him with very careful discretion. We know that Chazal were very critical of sages in the past. For example, Yeshua ben Prachya, with his admonishment of Yeshu, and we see from there that Yeshu left Torah and mitzvahs and started a lot of problems for Bnei Yisrael. And let's say a teacher doesn't follow the straight path, the correct path, even if he is a very wise sage, and the people really need his wisdom. You shouldn't learn from him until he returns to the straight path. As the pasuk says, Kisif say kayin yishmeru das v'seira yivakshu mipiu ki malach Hashem tziva'is hu. The lips of the priest should guard the knowledge, and the Torah that you request from his lips should be like that of a heavenly angel. Amru Chachamim, our sages taught, im doima harav lemalach Hashem tziva'is, if the teacher is similar to a heavenly angel, Torah yivakshu mipiu, then you should learn Torah from him, ve'im lav. But if he doesn't share these characteristics, al yivakshu Torah mipiu, then you should refrain from learning from this teacher. Halacha Beis, the Rambam speaks about the proper way of instruction. Ketzad melamdin, how do you teach these students? Harav yeshiv barosh, the teacher sits in the front of the class. V'talmidim lefanov mukafim atara, and all the students sit in a semicircle in front of him, so that all of the people could see the teacher equally and hear what's coming from his mouth. The teacher shouldn't be sitting on a chair while his students sit on the floor. Either everybody should be sitting on the floor, or everybody should be sitting in chairs. It used to be back in the day that the teacher would stand and the students would sit. This wasn't done out of any difference in respect, but it was just so that the teacher's spirits could be calm while giving over the material. And then the minhag changed, and after the destruction of the temple, that everybody sat when learning. And this comes from the famous Mishneh, which tells us in Saita that from Moshe to Rabbi Gamliel, everybody used to stand while learning, but when Rabbi Gamliel died, the honor of Torah was nullified from this world, and from then on, everybody sat when learning. Halacha Gimel, the Rambam is going to speak about a meturgaman, a translator. If the teacher wants to teach directly to the students, he should do so. But if he wants to teach with a interpreter in between. Hametargim oimod beinoi uveina talmidim. So then this interpreter stands between the teacher and the students. V'harav oimer metargim, and the teacher speaks to this, what we're going to call interpreter or translator, Mitargim, Mashmiya, L'chola Talmidim. And then this Mitargim would go and tell it over to the students. Okay, so what is a Mitargim? So there's three opinions. Opinion number one says that a Mitargim, based on the word Targum, would translate. The early Magidei Shiurim, the Rabbanim, the rabbis that were teaching over this Torah, they used to speak in Hebrew. But the Lashon, the language of the common folk, was Aramaic. And therefore, the rabbi would go and teach the studies in Hebrew. And then the Mitargim would translate it into Aramaic and tell it over to the students. The second opinion holds that the Mitargim actually just served as a modern-day microphone. Back in the day, there was these class sizes, and they didn't want the rabbis to strain their voices, so the rabbi would say in a quiet voice to the Mitargim, and this was a person with a loud voice, and he would go and echo exactly what the rabbi said to the students in a loud voice so that they could hear. The third opinion states that the Mitargim actually played a much greater role. You see, these rabbis, they usually were at such a lofty level of Torah knowledge and of godliness that when they spoke, the common folk would actually not be able to understand what they're saying. So the Mitargim was usually somebody who could understand, and he would take the words of the rabbi and he would translate it, so to speak. He would adapt it to a level that the students could understand. Okay, so continuing, so when the students would ask questions to this Mitargim, he would then turn around and ask it to the teacher, and then the Rav would answer the question to this Mitargim, and then he would turn around and answer it to the person who asked the question in the first place. And the relationship worked that the rabbi would never raise his voice louder than that of the Mitargim, and the Mitargim would never raise his voice louder than the Rav when he was turning to ask him the question that had just come from the class. They both honored each other by not raising their voices louder than one another. This Mitargimon could not change the words of the rabbi. The only exception to this rule is if this Mitargimon was the rabbi or father of the Rav, and therefore the Rav has a commandment to respect and honor them, and therefore they could change his words. One more scenario. Let's say the teacher says to this Torgamon, Kach Amarli Rabbi Oy Kach Amarli Abamari. Let's say he teaches over something. In so to speak, he says, this is what my teacher taught me, or this is what my father, my master taught me. When the Torgamon turns around and teaches it to the students, he says it actually in the name of the father or the teacher. He says, this is what ex-rabbi said. Even though the teacher didn't say the name of his father or the rabbi that said it, that's only because since he has this obligation of kivud abba or kivud rabbi, so he couldn't say his father or the rabbi's name. But when the Turgaman, who doesn't have that obligation, is giving it over to the Talmidim, so he is allowed to say it in the name of who the teaching was originally from. Halacha Dalid, the Rambam is going to speak about teachers that can't get through to their students. Harav shali made v'loy hevinu talmidim. Let's say the rabbi teaches, but the students just can't understand. Loy yichaz aleim v'yirgaz. He shouldn't get upset and angry with them. Elachayzer v'shein hadavar afilu kamei apomim. Rather, he should return and teach it over and over again, many times, ad shiavinu oimek halacha, until they understand the depths of the ruling. V'chein loyomer hatalmid, and so too the student shouldn't say to the rabbi, Hevanti, that I understand. V'hu loy hevin, if he doesn't understand, meaning he shouldn't just say, okay, I got it. Elachayzer v'shar lafiu kama pa'amim. Rather, he should return and ask over and over again. V'im kas olav rabbi v'ragaz, and if the rabbi gets upset and angry with him, that he keeps on asking, yomer loy, the student should say to his rabbi, Rabbi, my master, Torah, this is Torah, v'lilmaid ani tzarich, and I am here to learn, v'datik tzara, and I'm sorry that my knowledge is small, and therefore it's difficult for me to grasp. Halacha hey, the Rambam is going to speak about interpersonal relationships between students. Lo yeh hatalmid boish mechaverov shalamdu mipam rishona oishniya v'hu lo lamed ela achar kama pa'amim. A student should not be embarrassed if his colleagues got it on the first shot, but it took him 1, 2, or even 3 tries to understand. If he's going to be embarrassed by this, it's going to come out that he's going to enter the house of study and he's going to leave learning nothing. Therefore, our early sages taught us, a embarrassed one will never learn, and a short-tempered one will never be able to teach. Meaning, this is a never-ending cycle because it takes many times to give over the material, and a teacher might become enraged by this behavior, and the student might be embarrassed to go and ask for him to repeat himself, etc., and the cycle repeats itself. Now the Rambam qualifies, when were these principles applied? These only apply when the students don't understand the material, either because it's so deep or because their minds can't grasp it because they're just too small. If the teacher sees that they're being lazy and they're just not applying themselves to understand the material, Lirgois Aleim, he's required to get upset with them. And let's just remember what we said in Hilchos Deis, Perek Beis, Halacha Gimel, that this isn't a real type of anger, but it's an anger that awakens the students, and they think he's upset, but really deep down, the teacher is completely calm. And he shamed them in order to arouse their concentration. And this is what our sages taught when they said, you should cast fear onto your students. It's talking about this attitude so that they won't get distracted and they will be completely concentrated. It's not proper for a teacher to act frivolously in front of his students. He shouldn't joke with them, he shouldn't eat or drink with them, so that the fear of him is upon the students and they'll be able to learn quickly. Halacha Vav, the Rambam is going to begin to discuss different types of questions asked to a teacher. You shouldn't hound the teacher with questions the moment he enters the study hall. Rather, you should let him sit and order his thoughts. When he's in a state of calm. Two students should not ask the teacher a question at the exact same time, speaking over one another. You shouldn't ask him based on a topic that's not relevant to the study material. Rather, you should ask him questions based onto the material that you're learning, because if you ask him something that he's not currently involved with, he might err and answer incorrectly, and then he's going to be very embarrassed and you're going to embarrass him. So in order to stay away from this, we just ask questions that have to do with the subject material. And the Rambam says a teacher could say incorrect things or speak stories in order to jolt the concentration of the students. They could say, wait, that's not correct. And he says, aha, see what I did there? Or he could say something in order to see if they remember what he taught them previously, or if they don't remember that. And we don't have to say that the teacher could go off topic and he could go on a sidetrack and teach them something that has nothing to do with the subject material in order to just spur their awakeness. Halacha Zayin, the Rambam continues, you shouldn't ask a question while standing, nor should you answer a question while standing. There's a few different approaches in this halacha. Some say that the Rambam was only discussing these very difficult type of shilas, but if you have a question for a rabbi, that's something later, so he could be standing. But if it's something that's going to require a lot of concentration, so then he should sit down. And this is exactly like we said before, that the teacher should be in a state of calm when answering questions. Others say that this really is just directed at the student. The rabbi can be standing if he wants, but the student should be sitting when asking the question in order that he's able to channel his thoughts in a very thoughtful way. You shouldn't ask a question while standing taller from far away. Nor should you ask from behind the elders. These are all signs of disrespect. You should only ask the rabbi questions relevant to the topic matter, and this isn't just a repetition of what we said before, but before we were speaking about the subject matter in a general sense, and now we're saying even in a specific sense. Let's say you were learning Hilchos Shabbos, so don't even ask questions that have to do with a different malacha, but stay within the same malacha. Alternatively, some have the word ke'inyan, which means to the point, instead of bi'inyan, which means in the subject material. And you should only ask questions out of fear. And you should never ask a question that has to do with more than 3 halachas, because that's beyond the grasp of a relevant question, and it could cause the teacher to become confused and answer in an incorrect way. Halacha Ches, then I'm going to speak about what happens if 2 people come to the teacher with a question, whose question gets precedence. Two people who have a question, shal echad be'inyan, shal echad shalei be'inyan. Let's say one guy comes with a question relevant to the subject material that they're learning, and one that doesn't. Niskakin la'inyan. So the rabbi first deals with the question that has to do with the subject material. Okay, Maisa ve'ena Maisa niskakin la'Maisa. A question that has to do with something that's very practical or something that's not practical, we deal with the thing that's practical. As we said before, that Talmud is really greater because it's Yaveh Lidei Maisa, it comes to do an action. So if a person has a question of action, that comes before just Stam Talmud. Halacha Midrash, let's say something that has to do with your observance versus something that has to do with darshaning psukim, learning things out of the Torah. Nizpakin lahalacha. So we always give precedence to that which has to do with your observance. Midrash v'haggadah. Let's say you have a question. One is a question regarding the darshaning of psukim, learning things out from the written Torah, and the other one has a question based on agada, which is the stories, etc., in the oral law. Nizpakin l'midrash. So we go with the darshans first, the drashas first. Haggadah v'kal v'chaymer. Let's say you have a question. One is a question with regard to this type of story, type of Torah, and the other one has a question based on a fortiori, which is a concept from the 13 principles that we learn oral tradition from, where you take something that is known about a prohibition or a commandment of lesser statute and you apply it to a prohibition of commandment of a greater statute. So which one comes first? Nizkakin lekal v'chomer. So you give attention to the fortiori first. Kal v'chomer ugzeira shava. Now let's say you have two of the 13 principles that we learn oral tradition from. A kal v'chomer, like we said, and a gzeira shava. Gzeira shava is when you have two either exact or similar words in different places, and that allows us to learn different laws pertaining to one to the other. Now it's important to point out that this must be done with a tradition, teacher to teacher, from Moshe Rabbeinu. A person cannot create his own gzeira shava. So let's say you have a kal v'chomer and a gzeira shava. Which one comes first? Nizkakin lekal v'chomer. We give attention first to the kal v'chomer, and the reason for this is because a kal v'chomer has to do with one's original thoughts. They come from a person's own cheshbon, whereas gzeira shava is passed down from teacher to teacher until Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay. Now let's say two of the questioners, one is a great sage and the other is a student. So we give precedence to the sage. Talmud v'ama'aretz. Now let's say you have a student and an ignoramus. So you give precedent to the student, because even though he's not a great sage, but there's some sort of honor that has to do with the fact that he is learning Torah. Now let's say both of them are wise, or Shnehem Talmidim, or both of them are students, Shnehem Amei Aretz, both of them are ignoramuses. Sha'alu Shnehem b'shtei halachos, b'shtei she'elos, shtei tshuvos, shtei maisim. So let's say then they're dealing with the same stories, the same inyan, etc. So what do? Harishos biad hatorgamon me'ato. So then the decision falls to the Matorgamon, which we explained what he is earlier. Halachatas, the Rambam speaks about certain laws pertaining to the Beis HaMedrash, the study hall. Ein yishenim bebeis HaMedrash. You should never sleep in the Beis HaMedrash. V'chol hamisnamnim bebeis HaMedrash. Anybody who dozes off in the study hall, chachmasei naases kiroyim, his wisdom gets torn to shreds. V'chein amar shlem bechachmasei. And so too, King Solomon said in his wisdom, ukroyim talbish numa. You are clothed in rags of cloth. Ve'ein masichin bebeis hamedrash ela b'divrei seira bilvad. You shouldn't speak idle conversations except for the words of Torah itself. This is twofold: one, because of bittul Torah, and the second, because of kavod to the beis hamedrash. Afilu mi shenis atesh. Even somebody who sneezes ein oimrim loy refuah bebeis hamedrash. You shouldn't say refuah to him in the beis hamedrash, which is the equivalent of saying gesundheit or bless you. Ve'ein sarich loymar shara dvarim. And for sure, if that isn't allowed, then other things are not allowed. Ukidushas beis hamedrash chamura mikedushas batei knesiyos. And the Rambam finishes by saying that the sanctity of a study hall supersedes the sanctity of a synagogue. And anyways, Hashem, we're going to delve into those halachas in depth in the future. But just one nafkamina, one practical difference that comes out of here is that if you had a synagogue and you wanted to turn it into a study hall, that would be permitted. But to take a study hall and to turn it into a synagogue, that would be forbidden.